Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel once again. So we just got done with the final UFC event of 2021 and what an incredible year it was for the UFC and for all us fight fans in general. So looking back at this past weekend, obviously two big events as we started the day off with UFC Vegas 45 and then the rematch between Tyron Woodley and Jake Paul capping off the day. So without any further ado, welcome back to Helios Sports World and welcome to the new video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Alright, so I want to start off by recapping the UFC Vegas card, UFC Vegas 45 card in brief, which personally I think was the bigger event of the day, and is the UFC we're talking about. It had to be the big event of the day. Anyway, getting down to the fights, a big shout out to all the winners, starting off obviously with Derrick Lewis, who was victorious in the main event against Chris Daukaus. Another huge win for the Black Beast, and I want to start off by saying that whenever Derrick Lewis is in the zone, whenever Lewis is completely focused with the task in hand, he is a very, very dangerous man. Now, we obviously saw this focused version of Derrick Lewis on Saturday, where he seemed very, very unbothered by all the little offense that Chris Daukaus had in the fight. In the early seconds, we saw Daukaus went for those leg kicks. Derrick Lewis, being Derrick Lewis, didn't really care much about them. And then, of course, Lewis himself attempts that incredible roundhouse kick, one that Paul Felder was mentioning on commentary. And from there on, it was just showcasing of ridiculous strength from the Black Beast. I mean, you could clearly see after that roundhouse kick, there was this big pause. There was this one brief moment where Derrick Lewis was looking for an opening. And the fun part is, he didn't even need to create an opening for himself. It was just raining lefts and rights. Lewis went in with this flurry of punches, and in the end, it was just a matter of sheer strength and power that we're so used to seeing from the Black Beast. At one point in the fight, it almost felt as if Derrick Lewis was directing this fight, and it almost felt as if he was telling Chris Daukaus that he was going to knock him out whenever he wanted to. Now, I'm not saying this to take a dig at Daukaus, but it's just that Derrick Lewis makes everything look so simple. Like, that's the thing about him. You go back to his fight against Alexander Volkov or his fight against Curtis Blades. Derrick Lewis was losing to Volkov, but with just 10 seconds to go, he gets the victory out of nowhere. And similarly with Blades, I don't think there was anyone who expected Lewis to win against Blades, given he's so good on the ground, given his wrestling is so good. But then again, Lewis just gets the knockout out of the blue, gets the victory eventually. So it's this unorthodox style of Derrick Lewis that makes him so dangerous, and it is this style of Lewis which makes it hard to review his fights as well. I mean, there is barely anything to break down here other than the fact that Derrick Lewis's strength and his power is a lot more superior than Chris Daukaus. And I'm not really even sure if the experience factor came into play in this fight because Lewis had already fought Cyril Gane in his last fight, and which obviously we already know that Gane isn't as experienced as Lewis is in the UFC. So, yeah, another big win for Lewis, and I totally could see him fighting Stipe Miocic next. I mean, before this fight, he said that he would love to fight the former heavyweight champion, and I think that would be a good fight. But then again, a fight between Derrick Lewis and Jairzinho Rozenstruik also makes for another great heavyweight fight as well. So yeah, we shall see what's next for the Black Beast, and let me know in the comments who you think Derrick Lewis should be fighting next. So moving on, and another fighter who stood out for me from this card was none other than Cub Swanson. Now, I could put Mateusz Gamrot on the same bracket as well, but what I saw from this past weekend felt like an entirely new version of Swanson, and of course, he bounced back from that brutal loss to Giga Chikadze from his last fight. Now, getting down to the fight itself, and it was like Michael Bisping said on commentary, Swanson looked like this big ball of energy who was ready to explode, and he did explode. During the fight, Swanson's hands were low, his body language and his movement was superb. But of course, when your hands are that low, there is always that possibility of you getting tagged on the chin, and that is exactly what happened to Swanson as well. Of course, when you're coming in with so much energy, fighters do often tend to go off track a little, and that is exactly how Swanson got tagged with that big right hand early on in the fight. Swanson, though, he was very precise with his shots, and you could see how well he found those openings. He hit that beautiful left hand and caught Elkins with another sharp right hand, which dropped him early on in the fight. Now, I do think that Cub Swanson could have finished the fight right there itself when Elkins was knocked down, but regardless, Swanson looked very slick on the night, and like I said, his movement was probably the most beautiful thing about this fight. I mean, Swanson knew that he couldn't risk getting tagged in the chin, but his head movement in the closing stages was just brilliant. And the way he dodged that left hand from Elkins, then caught him with the right and the left. Now, Swanson, of course, didn't rush into finishing the fight, but I mean, it was pretty much over by that point, to be honest. The spinning heel kick at the end was just the icing on the cake, even though he didn't really connect the kick entirely. And I'll just quickly share my screen in order to try and show you guys what I'm talking about. Okay, we have the fight right there. Hopefully, we don't get into too much trouble for this. But yeah, just quickly show you guys. Okay. Just watch for Cop Swanson's beautiful head movement and the way he catches Elkins with that beautiful combination as well. Just watch. Look at that movement. Dodges the left hand, catches with the combination. I wish I could play this in slow mo. Just brutal, brutal, brutal stuff. I'm going to stop this right here. So yeah, it was good to see another OG of the fight game staying relevant with another big win. And yeah, let me know what you think about what did you make of Cup Swanson's latest performance, his victory this past weekend, and who you think he should be fighting next from the stacked featherweight division. So moving on, and speaking of the last bit of action from this past weekend, the big rematch between Tyron Woodley and Jake Paul. Obviously, it wasn't the fight that I was expecting it to be, and I say this while not being the biggest fan or follower of boxing. Anyway, this rematch, if you compare it with the first fight between Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley, obviously it was a lot more boring than what I had expected it to be, and there was barely any sort of back and forth in this fight, and honestly, it did not feel very competitive to me. I mean, there was barely any action throughout the course of this fight. The ref kept getting involved almost every 2 minutes due to all those clinches, and overall, it just made Tyron Woodley look worst, in my opinion. And Woodley, being a former UFC welterweight champion, he barely had any moments in this fight. And if you go back to that first fight, he had that one big knockdown where Jake went through the ropes, and this was just a completely different scenario, if you ask me. And Woodley at least did make that big takedown and slammed Jake on the mat, almost fulfilling every MMA fan's wish by doing that. But then again, overall, a poor performance from Woodley. And as for Jake Paul, I think this fight itself also gave him a bad rep, and I'll explain why. The whole purpose of Jake Paul being a boxer is the entertainment factor that is attached to it. But this past weekend was a whole different story, in my opinion, because there was barely any action in this fight that we haven't seen already. That was barely anything in particular different in this fight that we haven't already seen in a Jake Paul fight before. Now, like I said, this fight felt boring, and it that also reflects on Jake Paul's overall performance as well. I'm not criticizing his boxing skills. I do think he knows what he has gotten himself into. But with that being said, Jake Paul still hasn't fought actual boxers because Tyron Woodley is not known for his boxing skills after all. Now, I totally understand Jake Paul playing it smart in this rematch, hence why it felt a little bit off to all of us. On the other hand, if you compare Logan Paul versus Floyd Mayweather to what we just saw this past weekend, that fight was entertaining and it served its purpose, whereas this Woodley versus Jake Paul fight did not do that. So now that Jake Paul is finally transitioning himself into fighting guys like Woodley, Tommy Fury, and presumably against Nate Diaz if his contract eventually runs out, you might go on to say the same thing regarding Jake Paul's fighting style. Now, Jake knows that he has to fight smart in order to survive against the likes of Fury and Diaz, which means that all his fights going forward might not live up to the hype. It might not be as competitive as we thought it would be, which was pretty much what we saw this past weekend. And but we shall see what happens with Jake Paul. Obviously, he still has a long way to go. He certainly might fight Tommy Fury next, and yeah, that should be his biggest test in his boxing career so far. And yeah, that's basically it. That's basically the um, but that's basically all I had for this fight. I didn't really think it was that competitive, like I said, but it should be interesting seeing where Jake Paul goes on from here. And as for Tyron Woodley, I don't know if he's going to stick to the world of boxing or if he's going back to MMA. Probably could sign with Eagle FC at this rate, but we shall see. And that's basically it for this video. I'm also hopeful that I will be looking into the Stephen Thompson versus Bilal Muhammad fight from UFC Vegas 45 and do a little breakdown of that and the entire scenario at welterweight. So yeah, let me know in the comments what did you make of this two big events from this past weekend and the fights from this weekend, and anything else if you want to add on. Let me know in the comments. I'll see you guys in the next one.